in New York City, is a Kachin feminist theologian from Myanmar. Her doctoral work focuses on constructing eco-theology that critically interrogate the intersection between capitalist economy with environmental catastrophe to reimagine collective emancipation. Finally, Dr. Sujin Ko. She is the Graduate Future Program Director of Humanities Center at the University of California, Irvine. She is also the Director of Adult Education and Resident Theologian for St. Mark and New Hope Presbyterian Churches in Oregon County. Her writing focuses on the interaction of religion, theology, critical ethics study, and gender and sexuality studies, as well as graduate education reform. Now, the panelists will present consecutively, one at a time. Now, please give a warm welcoming to all of our 4 panelists.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And I just want to acknowledge the program committee and all the folks who have worked so hard to organize this wonderful gathering and to bring all of us together. So my name is Juliana Nessie, and I'm excited to be here with you all tonight. So thank you for the invitation. I'm humbled and excited to learn from all of my esteemed panelists as well, and also share a little bit about my research with all of you. So thank you. This is a very beautiful space to be in. All right, so I'm gonna start off a little bit about my research. My research mainly focuses on women in Samoa, specifically in the Pacific Islands. So to hear the introduction about the collective work that all of you have done in the past and the present in bringing together everyone for the conference is super exciting, because it very much shares the same stories and essence with the women that I work with as school organizers, specifically for students with intellectual and physical disabilities in Samoa and more broadly Oceania. So I'm going to start off here with a short vignette to kind of talk a little bit about what my work is about and kind of how, and some of the themes potentially that we can kind of flesh out with the theme of the conference, and also just other intersecting topics. So I am a brown Samoan woman with dark black hair. I have brown eyes. I am wearing a black dress with black and white dangly earrings. And so today, my talk will focus on 2 facets. I'm specifically interested in disability activism in Samoa by Samoan disabled and non-disabled women in the 1970s. And then the second facet is thinking about the solidarity politics that went on in these spaces, and what can we learn from Indigenous disability activism and their solidarity networks. So setting here is Samoa, 1976. Ngele is a 3-year-old boy who loves to dance and be around people. He had an older brother named Jay, who was 5 years old and already attending preschool. Ngele, that's spelled G-E-L-E, was also eager to go to school. Every morning, he watched as Jay got ready for school. He sat at the kitchen counter while Jay packed his pencils, eraser, and paper in his backpack, put his food in his lunch pail, and left for school. One morning, Ngele asked Sina, his mom, "When can I go to school like Jay?" Not knowing what to say, Sina replied, "We'll see." Yet Sina was bothered by her son's question, but was also motivated to find an answer. In her mind, she rehashed the reasons as to why Ngele could or could not go to school. She thought, well, he is potty trained, but he can be difficult to understand when he talks. He knows his ABCs, but he looks different from other children. He can write his name, but sometimes can't sit still. Despite Sina's justifications as to why Ngele should be in school, the reality was that schools at the time did not allow children with disabilities, let alone someone with Down syndrome like Ngele. So 2 questions that I want to kind of spell out here that helps us think about this particular vignette is in thinking about disability activism is how do we add that understanding around disability activism to our understanding of care, right? And belonging in the community. So care, this is very much a question about care work. And what is the role of land-based literacies and community knowledge in disability activism and decolonial politics or approaches? So in 1978, a group of women in Samoa, SAMOA, an independent state in the Pacific, came together to advocate for the inclusion of students with disabilities in schools. Representing the main island of Upolu, that's UPOLU, some of the women were parents of disabled children, disabled themselves, and were family members and allies. Their collective goal was to establish educational institutions for people with disabilities. Yet, gathering support from the community was difficult, given the popular discourse about disabled people as ulukae, which is the term for that which translates to broken head or quote unquote uneducatable, and not worthy of inclusion in schools. The stigma and shame attached to how people with disabilities were treated applied to the educational realm and more broadly the Samoan community. So what compelled these women to support disabled students in the late 1970s? What can we learn from this case study about the relationships between disabled people, indigenous lands, and colonial educational policies, right? So the larger project here is a book project of mine which looks at these 2 particular schools called Ongafia Malama and Loto Taumawhai, which were 2 schools primarily established in the 1970s to educate students with intellectual and physical disabilities. And so it's the project is around the oral history and sort of the social history of these women organizing these schools and why they organized. And there was about 30 women who came together and volunteered their time, resources, and networks to organize these schools because they were non-government, they were NGOs or non-government organizations. And so I think that eventually the founding of these 2 schools forced the restructuring of the education system in Samoa, which included disabled students, but also ironically, this is kind of skipping to the findings here, they continued to segregate disabled students from their non-disabled peers. So you kind of have this paradox of creating schools, wanting to go to schools, and then they do it, but then ironically, that also creates, they're still isolated from their non-disabled peers. So this project brings together, like our panel, an interdisciplinary fields of study, such as disability studies, indigenous studies, and Pacific studies, as well as gender studies, to think about Samoan women activism as a form of decolonization. So this is a huge kind of backdrop of my work, is thinking about this story is not just about the creation of these schools, but also the backdrop of what was happening at the time in the 1970s in the Pacific Islands or Oceania. There was a lot of decolonial or decolonizing movements, social movements that were also happening at the same time. And so the women that I work with oftentimes says to me, you know, education was also for decolonization. So I was really sort of curious about that whole idea of using education as a system to think about decolonial politics, right? So, which is also very different from disability activism. And so much of my work then argues that disability activism is very much a part of sort of decolonial approaches to understanding education. And then also thinking about community knowledge, right? So thinking about Samoan concepts of collective care, some concepts of service, which is called tautua, right? And tautua is the Samoan concept of, it translates to service, but it really is sort of a reciprocal concept of care, like you are responsible for each other. There's a kind of accountability that you have to not just yourself individually, but also collectively, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be about you getting something back about that responsibility, but it's more of sort of this human rights coordinated approach to understanding your relations to other people. And then another point here that I just want to add to this conversation is that the women were also very invested in finding land, right? So land is a big piece of this conversation. They were very interested in the acquisition of land to establish the schools. And for them, finding land to locate the schools was a way to root, as in R-O-O-T, the schools within the community. So it was really part of their inclusion politics of finding land to root the schools. And unfortunately, the much broader conversation here is how much of the community and society, especially the governments, did not want to lease land out to the women or to provide places for these schools. So this is part of the conflict and the kind of stories here that we explore, is how the women organized outside of the islands with other entities and other groups to support their agenda of creating schools. And this is a much broader conversation we can talk about in Q&A as well. So in thinking more about land, I also think about indigenous feminist work, as well as women of color and feminists of color work around organizing and solidarity politics in terms of this kind of collective care work that we have and responsibility to each other. So here I think about Native Hawaiian scholar Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua's work, in which she calls land-centered literacies. And this term she coined is about work that is broaden understandings of literacy as like simply about reading, and it's not simply about reading and writing, right, printed text, but land-based literacies include the ways Kanaka Oiwi, or Native Hawaiians, develop practices of reading the stars and other celestial bodies and events, offering chants in our own language, and then observing and finding meaning in the responses of the wind, the rain, the birds, the waves, and the stones. So she advocates for this kind of writing ourselves into the landscape, or land, and drawing water through irrigation ditches, and thinking about taro or kalo farms, and how many of those sort of indigenous and Hawaiian understandings of care and also food, right? This is all also about food and providing food that is local and nutritious for people. So part of this work as well very much thinks about solidarity politics that went on in these spaces, and I think all of us here can make these kinds of connections given the work that all of you have done here, and specifically between groups that are sometimes very different in their needs and agendas. So here we have a group of women who some were parents, some were educators, some were business owners, and then you have sort of foreign or international groups that just supported their goal of creating schools for disabled kids come together, right? So one of the women, Lupe, who is also an organizer, she said to me, we did this work because, quote, there was a need at the time, and this is just what we did. We came together to do. We were keen on educating all children with disabilities, and as a parent, I would want the best for my child too, end quote. So this is, I think Lupe's quote here is just a really nice summarization of how the women thought about their work, right? It wasn't just about their children, but it was about all the children on island. In kind of closing up some of these pieces, I just want to offer one more theme that I analyze in my work, and that is the theme of ableism. That is ABLEISM, which is a keyword that is often about the historical materialism that thinks about the non-disabled body as the preferred body, right? So if you are able-bodied and you're not disabled, that's the preference, or that is how our society often assumes a person is, right? But if they are not any of those things, then the material consequences of that is very drastic in terms of our structures and our systems that people with disabilities and also those with chronic illnesses often have to engage with. So in closing, this work is an example of women in Samoa's refusal to accept normative practices and structures for disabled children. Additionally, I argue that their disability activism went beyond schools and spaces. They were also arguing for a decolonial space that upheld and valued every person. The 1970s was also a period of decolonial activism and civil rights movements in Oceania, which I think is very much similar here to the US context. Community knowledge and practices are fluid and also open for change. Most importantly, thinking about cultural concepts as concepts that can be theorized and implemented along the way of knowledge production. So the organizers in this case were aware of this and strongly supported their efforts. Their solidarity politics and negotiating support came from allies and friends that were in New Zealand, Australia, Japan, the US, Canada, and the Philippines. And so lastly, thinking about disability activism as also a social movement that involves feminist challenges to patriarchal as well as ableist structures here. So I just want to just close with, I've also been thinking about here Yvonne Guevara's work, who has done work in Brazil. She's a nun in Brazil, and her work on liberation theology and ecofeminism is also very important. And Guevara's work, I think, parallels or has a lot of overlapping and intersecting themes with the population of women and people that I'm talking about in terms of focusing on poverty. So Guevara was very adamant about focusing on the everyday lives of poor people in Brazil and how our analysis around liberation also very much has to think about class, right, as a theme in our community. And this parallels the disability community because most of of people who are disabled in our communities oftentimes live below the poverty line in the standards of socioeconomic standards. And that's because most of them also are dependent on state programs, right? So for services, most of them can't work. So they don't have a living wage. And so I think this is part of the tensions that I'm talking about here, is that most of people in the disability community, unfortunately, belongs to a group that is often marginalized because they're not considered sort of this power block in our society. So there's this continual ways of understanding their lives as not as important, or there's inequities that continue to happen here. So I think I'm going to stop there and pass it on to Professor Ho here. Thank you.
Thank you, Julianne. First off, I'd like to thank Pan Autumn and specifically Christine Pei for inviting me to speak on this illustrious panel exploring themes of Asian American and Pacific Islander eco-theology and eco-spirituality. I would also like to start by acknowledging that all of us are currently on Kumeyaay land, land that has also been stewarded and cared for by the Luiseno, Cupeño, and Cahuilla peoples, and that they continue to live on this land and take care of it. And so I'm honored to be here as your guest and as their guest. So given how eco-theology explores not only the relationship between religion and nature in terms of the degradation of nature, but also ecosystem management, I will spend my 15 minutes sharing a few examples that came to mind when I was invited to reflect on this topic. So eco-theology seeks to identify prominent issues within the relationship between nature and religion, and also to outline potential solutions. So my first example is that of Buddhist monks and activists in Thailand and Cambodia who have been working together to protect threatened forests through the practice of tree ordination. So since the early 1980s, Buddhist monks have participated in development programs in Thailand and supported national goals of education, development, and modernization. However, many came to see industrialization, urbanization, and the spread of Western values as a problem. The Theravadan Thai monk Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, who passed away in 1993, tied the Buddhist belief in connections among all living things to ecological work. The Buddha was born under a tree. He achieved enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, and he delivered his first sermon and entered parinirvana under the shelter of trees. For religious and scientific reasons, the health of forest ecosystems is critical to the Buddhist idea of collective planetary well-being. So influenced by these ideas, Theravadan monks drew connections between reliance on environmentally destructive land clearing for cash and the self-destructive drive for material things. So the practice of tree ordinations, in which monks tie saffron robes around a tree, helps to connect the preservation of ecological systems to Thai, Buddhist, and Theravadan identity. So monks ordained trees in the 1980s and 90s as part of protests against commercial logging, deforestation, and pipeline construction. Monks worked to develop villagers' understanding of Buddhism through teaching and meditation practices, anthropologist Nicola Tannenbaum writes. With this as a foundation, the monks began projects that focused on local knowledge and cooperation, such as rice banks and community gardens. The idea of tree ordination won official support at the highest level of Thai politics. So the monks ordained trees as part of the 1996 celebration of the 50th anniversary of the king's reign. Tree ordination also was played out in northwestern Thailand in that same year because people were concerned about a proposed gravel pit that would contaminate their water supply. So organizers circulated a petition, gathered signatures, rented minibuses, and brought villagers to protest at the provincial council meeting. And then they planned a tree ordination. In a written invitation to the ceremony, they explained that the village was divided into the watershed area that should be left alone, as well as other regions where people needed access to cut wood or gather plants like mushrooms, bamboo, and medicinal herbs. They emphasized the forest's importance to the village water supply, as well as animals and humans in the area. So the tree ordination ceremony drew a wide base of support, and the assistant provincial governor attended. 5 different temples sent monks and lay people from the surrounding areas. So the ordination received widespread support, not only from the local communities, but from the Royal Project for Tree Ordination in Village Forests. So the royal support made the provincial and local level government officials more inclined and enthusiastic about changing their mind about the gravel pit project, demonstrating the power of tree ordination as a tool for community and ecological justice. So in this case, Buddhist monks integrated religious moral principles with environmental awareness. These eco-Buddhist campaigns highlighted how selfish and short-sighted desires for economic gain and accelerated development have led to the exploitation of natural resources. The monks saw it as their duty to bring traditional religious concepts and rituals to bear on contemporary ecological needs. And they provided consultations to government officials about environmental issues and implemented other sustainable projects. So this tactic of tree ordination gained media attention around the world for its innovative and inspiring message about the sanctity of the natural world. My second case study is that of Vandana Shiva, a world-renowned environmental thinker, activist, feminist, philosopher of science, and policy advocate. In 1982, Shiva founded the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology, RFSTE, an independent research institute that addresses the most significant problems around ecology. And then in 1991, she founded Navdanya, which in Hindi means 9 seeds or new gift. This was a movement in defense of biodiversity and small-scale farmers. Shiva has won many awards, including the Alternative Nobel Prize, known as the Right Livelihood Award, and she's been named among the top 5 most important people in Asia by Asia Week in 2001. She's often referred to as the, quote, Gandhi of grain, because of her activism with the anti-GMO movement, or genetically modified organisms. And American journalist Bill Moyers called Shiva the, quote, rock star in the worldwide battle against genetically modified seeds. Born in 1952 in India, Shiva is the daughter of a forestry official, and her mother was a farmer. She grew up near the foothills of the Himalayas, between the forest and the farm. She says, "My childhood had a continuity between the forest and the farm, and we lived and worked with biodiversity." Shiva went on to study quantum physics and the philosophy of science in Canada and developed an interest in environmentalism during a visit home when she discovered her favorite place in the forest had been cleared and a stream had been drained so that an apple orchard could be planted by a corporation. The decimated forest haunted her. While on her way to catch a plane to return to Canada, Shiva was talking to a tea vendor, a chaiwala, and he mentioned the Chipko movement. Chipko means hug in Hindi, and it's a movement from the women of the Uttarakhand region who protected trees by saying they were going to hug them. So this movement started in the 1970s as a woman-led nonviolent collective action against governmental policies that allowed industry to clear cut forests in the highlands of northern India. Following in the tradition of Amrita Devi, who 3 centuries earlier in 1730 embraced a tree to prevent soldiers sent by the Raja of Jaipur to cut it down, along with the rest of the forest. That's how the Chipko kind of tree hugging was inspired. So deforestation obviously leads to floods and landslides that can destroy small family farms. Out of necessity for survival, the women of the region who were traditionally charged with cultivation and livestock banded together to form the Chipko movement, which eventually grew to international renown. After introduction to this movement, Shiva returned to India every school break to work with this woman-led collective. That's what moved me into my activism, my ecological learning, my biodiversity learning. I always say my professors were the trees and the women of Chipko. So Shiva went on to found her research institute in her mother's cowshed, and then she proceeded to work on grassroots campaigns to prevent deforestation and the construction of dams. She's also known as a critic of Asia's Green Revolution, as well as the privatization of seeds and biopiracy. So let's see. Shiva and her collaborators and her allies have worked to establish seed banks throughout India to preserve agricultural heritage while also training farmers in sustainable agricultural practices. The Navdanya project, the 9 Seeds project, began as part of her research institute and strove to combat monoculture promoted by large corporations. Navdanya formed 40 seed banks in India and attempted to educate farmers on the benefits of conserving unique strains of seed crops instead of relying on corporations that were selling them genetically modified seeds. Shiva argued that in a time of climate change, the homogenization of crop production is deeply dangerous. And her idea is that a decentralized approach to agriculture based on biodiversity and locally adapted seeds is more likely to weather a changing climate rather than a system relying on monoculture and a few varieties of seeds. In 1998, Shiva launched the Diverse Women for Diversity, an international version of Navdanya, her seed-saving collective. In 2001, she opened a school and an organic farm called Biya Vidyapith, sorry, my Hindi's not great, offering month-long courses in sustainable living and agriculture in northern India. So Shiva has many books that explore biopiracy, biological theft through patent law and corporate trade agreements, the decrease in genetic diversity of crops, the privatization of water and the pollution of water for profit, and the problems caused by corporate domination. I will also add that part of her interest in biopiracy came from her own divorce proceedings, where she was fighting her ex-husband over custody of her son, and the idea that somehow somebody could own another living being was part of her thinking and frustration with the legal system in the process of her divorce. So Shiva has sought to foster the development of realistic solutions to globalization and earth democracy, justice, sustainability, and peace. And I encourage you to check out some of her books, as well as her edited collection, Manifestos on the Future of Food and Seed. So one concept that Shiva emphasizes is nonviolent farming practices, which contrast the connection that she makes between large-scale agriculture and the violence of war. Chemicals and pesticides used in fertilizers in large-scale agriculture are often the same that are used in warfare. And Shiva emphasizes the kind of existential violence that is perpetrated by stripping the land of biodiversity in the name of monoculture. Allowing diversity to thrive is nonviolence, says Shiva. All of us are interconnected. All of this is interconnected with the individual health of human beings. I want to show there's only one health, Shiva says. The health of our planet and our health is the same. The health of plants and our gut is the same health. One indivisible health. There's ecological health, the health of justice, the health of diversity, and working together. Cultivating and conserving diversity is not a luxury, it is a survival imperative. My final case study is that of Kristen Leach of Namu Farm, who is an active voice for seed sovereignty and community-based learning and movements in food justice. In 1982, Leach was born in, earlier than 1982. In the late 70s, Leach was born in Daegu, South Korea. She was then adopted by a white working-class Irish Catholic family in Long Island, New York. Her love of food began when she was young, working in her adoptive grandmother's massive garden, and also being invested in community gardens and the Food Not Bombs movement as a teenager. So she grew up in a family that instilled the importance of the community and the connection to the earth. So when she relocated to the Pacific Northwest, Washington, for college, before she moved to Washington, Leach also grew up in New York, influenced by the 1990s punk movement and also the community garden movement. She remembers as a teenager hearing a talk from Zapatistas from Chiapas in Mexico I'm out of time. Okay, so I'll finish up. Leach was exposed to the Zapatistas and the idea of peasant revolutions and conversations around globalization. When she relocated to the Pacific Northwest, she was able to connect with other farmers and seed companies that were interested in Korean natural farming. This is an environmentally regenerative way of growing food using indigenous microorganisms to enrich the soil, which is then topped with straw. Korean natural farming is also founded on equitable relationships between the farmer and nature. So with different partners, both white and Asian American, Leach went on to establish Second Generation, which is a California farmers collective and seed company, which is focused on seed stewardship, much in the same vein as Vandana Shiva, aimed at fostering biodiversity, healthier ecosystems, and more equitable food systems. She also founded Seed Stewards, first as a community-supported agricultural system, and then later as an educational program that brings together Asian and Palestinian heritage crops and encourages communities, predominantly Korean, Filipino, and Vietnamese, to gather, share stories around food and nature. So they have educational programs, they run programs for children, they have virtual potlucks where they share knowledge and share food. So Leach particularly is obsessed and fascinated with perilla, which is a beloved Korean crop and leaf, which for her was a gateway plant to discover her Korean roots, which she had not had a lot of contact with while she was growing up in New York. So Namu Farms is 2 acres located in Winters, California, and it aims to utilize sustainable agriculture as a platform to connect local Korean communities, minority, people of color farmers, and issues of farm justice, as well as preservation of tradition and culture. So since I'm out of time, I'm going to stop there and pass the mic, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. My presentation theme is a kitchen feminist meditation on perils and promises of ecology. And when I say kitchen this evening, I want to invite you to remember that kitchen is one of the ethnic groups in Burma, and I'm one of them, and two of my sisters, Toy and Sao, is also here. And so, yeah. This presentation is a Kachin feminist ecological reflection based on the Kachin women's experience of coarse displacement and environmental blight caused by extractive capitalism and militarism. I interrogate the relationship between extractive capitalism and militarism because they mutually constitute each other and benefit from the interaction. Focusing on poor Kachin women's experience of coarse displacement is the starting point for eco-theology that nurtures an ethos of deep solidarity. I pay critical attention to how environmental blight impacts poor Kachin women differently, as well as how they organize and struggle for collaborative survival. I argue that the process of eco-justice will be only a spiritual frivolity if it does not attend to the wounds of the earth together with the bodies of poor women caused by anthropogenic acting. To begin this process of attending, one has to relearn embodied knowledge of poor women of color, as well as resurrect the wisdoms of our ancestors and mothers, which is interweaving with the earth. More importantly, they tell an alternative story of resistance that disrupts the pervasive narratives of extractive capitalism and militarism. Before we go deeper into the Kachin feminist ecological reflection, let me share the ways in which militarism coupled with extractive capitalism exploit nature resources and displace both people and the land. Displacement and internally displaced people. In critical theology against US militarism in Asia, Professor Nami Kim and Professor Winhee Angel critically engaged the ways in which militarized violence, especially the omnipresence of US militarism around the world. The consequences of this militarism constitute a structuring force of immigrations, displacements, and diaspora. In the Myanmar context, we see the implicit and explicit presence of US militarism in and through its economic bonds of power with China that extracts and exploits the natural resources, as well as creates the category of internally displaced people in Burma and around the world. Furthermore, hierarchical dualism, which is the dominant form of the Western worldview that delivers a two-tier vision of reality that privileges the elite hub of a pair and subordinates the other, which is thought to have little or no intrinsic value of its own, but exists only to be used to the higher. This hierarchical dualism is the major taproot of the exploitation of the land and poor women of color. We see this hierarchical dualism in the functions of extractive capitalism and militarism, which commodify and exploits the land. The Kachin land, sandwiched between China and India, between China and the US, and between China and Myanmar military regime, makes the global experience of the entanglements visible and calls for solidarity. Due to the climate crisis, the global demand for green energy, especially from the West, is rapidly impacting the Kachin land's ecosystems. The Kachin land is known for its rich natural resources that has been the primary source of income for the military regime as well as for everyday people. Within the Kachin land, there are thousands of mining locations from gold to jade, from timber to amber, from building hydroelectric power dams to mining rare earths. According to Global Witness, there are more than 2,700 mining pools of heavy rare earths at almost 300 separate locations in the Kachin land. Today, rare earths reach into the lives of almost everyone on the planet, turning up in everything from the hard drives and cell phones to elevators and trains. They are especially vital to the fast-growing field of green energy, feeding wind turbines and electric car engines. And they end up in the supply chains of some of the most prominent companies in the world, including General Motors, Volkswagen, Mercedes, Tesla, and Apple. The US offshored its rare earths mining to China in the 1980s because of environmental issues. Since then, China has become the main source of exporting rare earths to the rest of the world. In 2016, China banned mining rare earths because of environmental degradation. According to the environmental scientists, it would take at least 100 years for the land to recover from toxic waste. China has turned to Burma for mining rare earths since 2016, and today 70% of China's rare earth exports are from the Kachin land. Due to the climate crisis, the global demand for rare earths is expected only to increase by 2040. Without responsibility and accountability to the environmental care and well-being of the poor, this global mission of green energy is only a force of extractive capitalism that is not only exacerbating Myanmar's existing unjust system, but as well as destroying ecosystems rapidly. Indigenous land, like the Kachin land, bears the cost of green energy while living with toxic waste that has been left behind and facing the loss of biodiversity at unprecedented levels. The local people are only left with reinforced traumas of poverty and pollution. In addition, there are already more than 100,000 Kachin people who have been internally displaced and millions of ethnic groups across the countries due to the aggressive military violence. This brief story of the Kachin land is only one of the painful witnesses that the environmental blight affects poor people and the land differently. Despite recent displacements, poor Kachin women raise their voices and fight for equal justice because they understand the interconnectedness with and the sacredness of the land. Poor Kachin women's equal justice and grassroots movements are grounded in their ancestors' animist cosmology that they belong to the land, not as a civilization, nation, or class, but as the radical egalitarian belonging of earthlings to earth. This animist cosmology is embodied knowledge and praxis of poor Kachin women. In my conversation with a Kachin environmental activist, she shared her experience of working with her fellow Kachin women. In the midst of the coerced displacement, poor Kachin women gathered together and strategized how to reclaim the land that has been violently taken from them and how to protect them. One of these grassroots movements started with small gatherings and became the national movement against building Irrawaddy Misong Dam, which is a mega hydroelectric power dam run by electric power companies from China, Japan, and Myanmar military regime. The dam was suspended temporarily from 2011 until today because of this nationwide protest. This poor Kachin women's struggle for collaborative survival with the land intersects with eco-spirituality grounded in African, Native American, indigenous cosmological perspectives that consider the earth as sacred and nature as a reflection of the divine. Like eco-womanism and ecofeminism, Kitchen's animist praxis is formed and informed by the lively relationship and kinship with vibrant cosmos. Its theory emerged through complex and intimate relationship with the land. The land is always the multitudes. Not only do people depend on it, but also learn from and with the land. This embodied knowledge of the land always emerges in and through interactive relationships with the spiritual world of things and the material world of spirits. A Christian feminist ecological reflection. This year, the Penautumn Conference theme, Eco-Justice Rising, Reviewing Our Futures, invites me to revitalize my ancestors' animism anew. We have come across the colonialist anthropologists cast animism as primitive, salvage, or barbaric. This colonialist connotation ignores creative and critical aspects of animism. Animism is an indigenous principle that is relational and creative. It emerged through interactive relationships with the land and more than human worlds. This animist praxis disrupts hierarchical dualism that treats the land as mere resources to be used for human consumption, or more contextually, the Western capitalist consumption. According to animist praxis, the land is our ancestor, meaning that the land itself and the conditions of the land impact our genome just as our ancestors do. We are born into it, composed and nourished by it, and return to it as well. Our mothers cultivate relationship with the land, which is neither ownership nor dominion over the land. Yet today, our relationship with the land has become more complicated and capitalistic, where land is commodified, extracted, and exploited. And we can always go home because of these fractured relationships, coerced displacement, and forced and unforced migrations. It is certainly not to romanticize animism as pre-capitalist or pre-colonial tradition, but rather to revitalize critical and creative aspects of animist ontology that honor and nurture lively relationships with the land. And the wisdom of our ancestor is alive today in the marrow of our bones and the bodies. Colonialism, extractive capitalism, and militarism has disconnected us from the land and severed us from our relationship with the land, often through violence. Today, restoring the relationship with the land requires us to restore the lands that have been taken from us. It also demands that we reconnect with the land where we are standing today. We will notice that the land bears memories, stories, scars, and consequences of colonial and capitalist destruction. The land is grieving as it becomes barren soil by absorbing toxic waste and polluted atmosphere we live. We are co-becoming with the land that is suffering and grieving. It is crucial to notice what has been lost and what has not been grieved. As we grieve with the land, we might witness life in unexpected ways. In this sense, deep solidarity is an invitation to become kin with more than human worlds and struggle for collaborative survival in the ruin that has become our collective home. It is rooted in the animist wisdom of interconnectedness and intra-becoming with vibrant cosmos. Thank you.
Thank you for that beautiful reflection. I want to begin by adding my thanks alongside the rest of the panelists to the Pan Autumn Annual Conference Committee, and especially to Hyun Lee for organizing the panelists tonight. I also want to thank just all of the Pan Autumn community, the executive committee, who has nurtured and sustained this community for 37 years. That's incredible. And thank you to Hanaka and to First United Methodist Church of San Diego for hosting us in this space. I also want to acknowledge that today is the 2-year anniversary of the murder of 8 people in the greater Atlanta area, 7 women of Asian descent. And so with that in mind, I think that communities like Pan Autumn are even more important today. I'm honored to speak alongside my fellow panelists today, and I want to preface my remarks by saying that I speak today as someone who isn't an expert, but a journey person who is learning alongside everyone here today. My talk today begins with zombies. This is not a sentence that I ever thought I would say or even write, given my typically extreme aversion for the horror genre on the whole. But this past Sunday, I finished watching The Last of Us, a TV series based on a video game of the same name. It's had a lot of media coverage, and there's a particular scene from it that frames the questions that I have tonight. Without spoiling too much of the plot, because I hate that, the series primarily takes place in the present day. In fact, 2023. And the world has been in the grips of a pandemic for the past 20 years. The pandemic, brought about not by a virus, but a fungal infection, has separated the world into infected and quarantine zones. Liminal spaces do exist where the infected, the zombies, lurk around in various stages of progressed infection. Their unseen presence naturally contributes to the series' persistent atmosphere of dread. At the same time, not all the horror in the show is solely located in the zombies themselves. The horror is dispersed across the remaining survivors, mainly in terms of their actions and decisions that they undertake in order to survive in a world that has been decimated by pandemic, death, the breakdown of large-scale infrastructures and food supply chains, military and insurgent violence, and a fundamental distrust of others. Although the action and the plot are necessary to drive the plot along, it is, after all, based on a video game. Thematically, there is much in the show that resonates with our own reality. Much of the built environment in The Last of Us is predictably grim. Broken windows, swinging light structures, toppled pillars and caved-in walls, rubble and dust. Abandoned cars and trucks litter the highways, often serving as the final resting places of many who were fleeing the infected, but then decimated by governmental bomb drops, justified as a necessity. Among such places especially, time seems to have stopped, or at least slow. The only evidence to the contrary is the presence of lush, overgrown vegetation which have sprouted in and around structures, draping itself over walls and roads as if nature is reclaiming the land that is rightfully hers. So, the pivotal scene. At a point in their journey, the main protagonists, Joel and Ellie, step out from a building that opens out onto a panoramic view that is vibrantly green and peaceful. Birds are chirping, and a mountain range is in the far distance. There, they are startled by the sight of a giraffe ambling about. Delightfully, the giraffe walks in their direction, and, with the giraffe's head at the height of their eyes, the young girl pulls off some leaves from a plant nearby and feeds the giraffe. It is one of the few scenes throughout the series that is joyful and beautiful, a respite and relief from the rest of the story. Because I'm a Christian theologian, I have to say that it was hard for me not to draw parallels between this scene and the Genesis narrative of the Garden of Eden. There is not only the feeling that one has stepped outside of the bounds of time as it exists, due to how the viewer steps out into an impossibly beautiful clearing space, but that even the natural affinity and curiosity between the girl and the giraffe feels like something that could only happen in Eden or in the pages of a children's book. It dares you to exercise a certain suspension of belief for the sake of experiencing delight. It is a fantastical scenario, but it also raises the question, could it happen? In the face of a global catastrophe, emerging from the natural environment, but certainly accelerated by human individual and collective choices, would nature, in fact, begin to emerge and begin the process of healing and restoration? As I mentioned, a striking feature about The Last of Us, unlike many apocalyptic narratives, is that it takes place in 2023 rather than in a distant future. In other words, its contemporary temporal framing points to the immediacy of the threats that the series alludes to. Perhaps not of zombies, but of the imbrication of the systemic phenomena of climate change, late industrialism, settler colonialism, and extractive capitalism. We often hear of the dangers to human and non-human life, of rising sea level changes and melting snow caps, of toxic air pollution and poisoned land and water, in ways that evoke a threat in the future. This future-oriented framing evokes the silent, still, and abandoned scene that Rachel Carson's Silent Spring begins with, rather than the chaotic, mundane, and familiar rhythms with which we find ourselves intimately involved here and today. That is part of the power of The Last of Us, that it squarely raises the question of how we are navigating these collective environmental problems right here and now in our immediate contexts. I would suggest that even when our work involves highlighting the uneven impact that climate change and pollution has on Black, Asian, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, that our analyses may not necessarily have direct impact on the decisions that we make in our everyday lives. This is what Kim Fortune and Heather Swanson identify as disaffection. In terms of our conference themes, disaffection can mean several things. It can mean being willfully or unintentionally ignorant of the reality that much of our produce and meat are sourced from industrialized agriculture and farms, rendering violence not only to the animals, but also to the laborers involved. Laborers who are often undocumented, live in substandard conditions, and are overwhelmingly people of color. It can mean being frozen into feelings of despair when we hear, as I did the other day, that President Biden had allowed for ConocoPhillips, the gas giant, to proceed with drilling in the federal Alaskan Arctic, despite a campaign promise that pledged otherwise. It can feel like that twinge of guilt when you've thrown out another single-use plastic, but throwing it out anyway, because deep down inside, you wonder if reusing or recycling really makes any difference. We've all been there. You might notice that all of these emotions that comprise disaffection are mostly negative, or at least not desired. If they are negative, what allows for us to participate in this disaffection? One part of this is that disaffection is learned over time. It is like that old and rather gruesome proverb of the frog being boiled alive in a large pot of water. Another part is that our vision of what could be is often so unclear. In other words, often we implicitly believe that we will only recognize the outcome of our collective climate change efforts if the world only appears before us as a scorched earth or as a lush and fertile paradise. Both visions envision the future as a state of exception, rather in the zone of what we understand and experience as reality on a daily basis. To conceive of our actions where the outcome is envisioned as a state of exception may offer a reason for why emotions of disaffection are predominant when it comes to envisioning meaningful action around climate change. I think it is fairly safe to say that everyone here is concerned about the environment, perhaps more vaguely or more specifically. We are not a group of climate change deniers. But because I think that our vision on what could be is mostly contained within these two options, the desolate Star Wars-like landscape or the new earth of Revelation, restored to its state of untouched purity, the challenge is as much about our actions or lack thereof as well as what animates our actions and relationships to each other and to the non-human environment. However, I think it is a particular challenge that Christian theologians and communities are, in fact, well equipped to address. What do I mean? In talking so much about ecological visions, not villains, I am suggesting that such visions are actually pedagogical ones, visions that teach and engage the listener or learner. In her article, Fables of Responsibility, the word response and then hyphen ability, Feminist Science Studies as Didactic Literature, Martha Kenney analyzes the stories that are narrated across feminist science studies for their didactic or teaching potential. A fable, like The Grasshopper and the Ant, a moral tale that deals with, citing Thomas Keenan, quote, the interpretation and practice of responsibility, our exposure to calls, others, and the names with which we are constituted and which put us into question, end quote. But, as Kenny notes, the word responsibility often evokes a tone of seriousness, of duty or obligation. This is why she lifts up the coined word responsibility, where fables are stories that are meant to cultivate a capacity for response. The feminist ethic of responsibility focuses not on being responsible, but on learning how to respond and opening up possibilities for different kinds of responses, end quote. Eco-theologians and eco-feminists in particular have done much to offer the case for why we should relate to the earth differently, as well as pointed to the ways that Christian theologies of dominance and production have contributed to environmental destruction. As Gail Yee and I talked about over dinner, climate deniers also have a theology. So, I think that there is a vital space for theologians and faith communities to limb the connections between policy actions, individual decision-making, community priorities, and theological visions. We ourselves must be the fables of responsibility, not merely its audience. How do we do this? To begin, the word cultivate itself contains some clues. Cultivate and care share the same etymological root. To cultivate means to slow down, to pay attention to one's immediate surroundings or the object at hand, to turn that object in one's hands in relation to the immediate context. It means nurturing something with hope and expectation, rather than fear or nihilism. It is not about being zombies. You cultivate something because you hope it will flourish. So for the remainder of my reflections, I want to propose that there are 3 connected ways where we can practice this cultivation: within ourselves in close relations, within our faith communities, and in connection to the non-human environment. Within these 3 connected ways, I offer that the responses that we seek to evoke are joy, creativity, and a resting in the enough, rather than a striving for the exceptional. It is an invitation to shift and reorient rather than building something new altogether. 1, within ourselves and close relations. How much of how we are nurtured and taught is about the pursuit of the excellent as the good, a virtue? And what are the subsequent disruptions to nature and to the earth in how we pursue those goals of excellence? Instead of looking at what I have at hand in the freezer, I drive 3 miles across town to get precisely what I want to eat and what I want my family to eat for dinner. We often drive our children everywhere in order to pursue the best opportunities for them. We choose convenience because we are in a rush. I'm not innocent of this, but we think that more rather than less is better, that excellence is being exceptional, and that love is providing our loved ones with avenues to the exceptional. 2, within our faith communities, we strive to provide our congregants and guests with exceptional opportunities, with the best worship experiences and the best teaching and preaching, the best fellowship experiences and retreats. It is extremely difficult to resist a capitalistic mindset, given the broader anxiety about numbers and relevance. But what if we slowed down and spent time cultivating a different relationship to our buildings, to our surrounding lands, and to our neighbors, of figuring out where our churches are in the context of the larger ecosystems in which they exist, of making alliances with our neighbors and communities of color on how we source our energy. What if we put our youth and elders in charge of a community garden, or about helping to reduce the carbon footprint of the building? What if we planted native plants and replaced our lawns? 3, in relationship to the non-human environment, do we know the names of the trees that we see and the birds that we hear? There's an app for that, actually. Do you water a plant or grow herbs in a pot? This is not an exercise in inducing guilt. Rather, it's to say, science can be your friend. It's an invitation to delight, to feel the ground underneath your feet, to see the playfulness and slyness of non-human animals, to feel yourself as a part of the natural world rather than apart from it. It's an invitation to learn more about the natural world, to begin to tie back together what has been rended apart by disaffection. The more that is done, I suggest, the more we begin to work within the limitations of the seasons and time, rather than against those forces. It is feeling the weight of the creaturely enough, resting and working within those rhythms. These practical suggestions, however, can only be animated by a multiplicity of responses. And so here, I invite all of us, collectively, to think of ways in worship, music, through the interpretation of Scripture, to conjure a relationship to nature that recognizes ourselves as made from the dust of the earth, so that we may be among the trees that clap their hands and the hills and mountains that burst out in song. We only have today to find out. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for offering thoughtful, thought-provoking, beautiful, and also insightful. I also feel like it's very experienced near panel discussion. So now it's the time we will open the floor for questions and answer. So now feel free to ask your panelists any questions you may have. So right now it's 8:27, so maybe 2 person, you might have opportunity to ask a question.
Thank you, panelists, for all this wonderful presentation. I specifically have a question for Dr. Annecy. I think it's very amazing that you mentioned about like acquiring land for special education, decolonial activism, like inclusion politics. And my question for you is that, like, how do you think that this method will conceptually and practically interact with capitalism, as well as to the hierarchical dualism that Ban talks about? Do you think that this method has power to effect changes to the productivist and commodified understanding of land?
Thank you for your question. Tell me your name again.
Wayne.
Wayne, nice, thank you. Yeah, beautiful question. Thank you so much for the nudge here. Absolutely. I think that's sort of the theme that we have running across this panel is that of capitalism, which is very much embedded in the work that we do, in the struggles around distribution of resources, around accessing resources, but also holding on to resources, right? How do we kind of sustain a life within a capitalist system that often extracts, which I think was so beautiful with one of the panelists' reflections and offerings in her paper. Absolutely. I mean, capitalism is part of this rubric of humanitarian aid and charity that is very much intersecting with education, with NGOs, as well as thinking about, quote unquote, vulnerable groups, right? So, part of this project also, that is a chapter in my book project, is thinking about the limits of altruism and how do we think about sustainability in terms of funding for these schools, because most of us who know that nonprofits, NGOs, one of the struggles within these kind of organizations is always around monies, right? It's where do they find their funding and their budget for the next 5 years? There's this ongoing order of austerity that's always happening. And so I think, yes, these things are very much embedded and inherent in these topics that we're talking about. And I think the other part of your question around methodology around land is equally as important. I think part of the other part that I don't think I was quite clear in explaining is that there's inherently was a attitude that students with disabilities didn't necessarily deserve to have land to establish their schools that was ongoing, and the women organizers were very clear about that. They said, oh, it's not about them not wanting to give us land, it's about their negative positionalities and attitudes towards disabled kids. It's this idea, normative and ableist idea that, oh, they don't deserve to be educated. Look at all these other children that are able-bodied that should be educated, right? So this attachment of value to land and to entitlement to resources, I think, is very much a capitalist bag here inherent within these issues, but it also, provides a kind of lens, right? When we think about colonial systems that often privatize land, right? Privatizing meaning that land all of a sudden has values. And these are ongoing global conversations, I think, around the world, is that land is privatized. It's, here in the US, it's the property, right? It's the property values and the protecting. I mean, much of the Constitution, unfortunately, has been about protecting property, right? Whether it's objects or women or people, so I think, understanding that genealogy, I think, is really important, and that's something that sort of cuts across with all the kind of topics that we're highlighting. And then, did you have another? Did I answer all of that? Okay.
Talk a little bit about how the small women got the land.
Oh, yes. So Tammy just reminded me about, because Tammy also read my book manuscript, was a reviewer, so she knows the story very well. But thank you. Yes. So the women advocated for land. They went to the government, they went to different schools and said, hey, let's partner so we can find land to establish these schools. And the government reluctantly gave them land after the women bugged them for years. They just advocated and went to meetings, made meetings with everybody, sort of shamed them into giving over land or at least considering. So finally, they were able to convince one of the government organization or branches, department, which was called the WESTEC, which is the Western Samoa land trust kind of organization branch of the government. And so they said, okay, well, we have land for you that you can lease. So the women were so excited to finally have a place to locate the schools. And so then the government said, okay, well, you can have this 3.25 acres of land. It's all seawater, swampland. If you can fill it in, then you can have it for your school. So that was another episode of the women advocating then to fundraise and to figure out how to fill in this swamp water land so they can just establish a building on there. And then, I think the other part of that conversation is this is the kind of value and normative attitudes that that government and the everyday discourse, right, at the time was that there was no need for resources to be provided to this particular group of people that we're talking about. So there's so many different layers, I think, but thank you for that question.
We are going to take one more question, then we will give opportunity to the online group. Any other comment or questions?
Hi, Rita Brock. I'm thinking about this sense of land as incredibly powerful, and the sense of land as ancestry, and what the possibilities are for those of us who don't have a land, who may have been born somewhere and got dumped somewhere else, or I grew up in the U.S. military. I've lived in Germany and in Japan and the United States. So it's like I don't know that I have that sense of land as an ancestry, as where things that are profoundly important in my life live for me, because it's so much disruption and movement. And so what I'm trying to figure out, what is the sense of land that we can claim as visitors or as colonizers, as it were?
Yeah, Rita, that's a great question. I think, my third example of Kristen Leach actually is, might be able to offer one perspective on that query. I mean, Leach, was an adoptee. She was, taken from her country of birth, grew up in New York, then moved to Washington and ended up in California. But it was through her relationships in California with farmers who were interested in cultivating respectful and reciprocal relationships to the land as opposed to transactional or extractive relationships, that kind of, and also being inspired by the Zapatistas and other, kind of punk DIY subcultures and communities in the 1990s. I think also, the fact that Leach didn't grow up with contact with her Korean culture or her Korean ancestry, but as an adult, took the time to go to Korea to, meet Korean women and farmers who gave her seeds that she then took back to California. And in California, on her farm, in which she doesn't own, she subleases that land. So she doesn't own the land, right? But she has a relationship with other Asian American farmers in California that allow her to develop these kind of heritage crops and think about how she can cultivate kind of adaptability and resilience so that the seeds are more drought resistant, right? And she talks about how her practice of seed saving and cultivating seeds is founded not on the idea of kind of success, either getting the crop she wants or making a profit, as much as she kind of has this long-term sense of being willing to fail, and also creating programs which has allowed her to build an Asian American dominant, but also a multiracial community through which she kind of has strengthened her own Asian American identity. So I think even if we don't own quote unquote land, right, And Leach talks about this in interviews and videos. She's like, it's okay if you try to grow a plant and it dies. It's okay if you can't grow anything, but you just enjoy food. It's just, like Sujin said, you know, taking the time to kind of reflect on our relationships to, you know, food and plants and non-human life around us, I think is a step towards, you know, ecological respect and perhaps eventually, you know, a more creative sense of responsibility and accountability that hopefully will help, you know, mitigate, you know, the drive to, you know, climate destruction and you know, the apocalypse. So that's what I would say, is that I think all of us can play a role, even if we don't own land per se on our own, or you know, even if we've been ripped away from our homelands and our ancestry because of both involuntary and voluntary migrations.
I just wanted to follow up on Tammy's remarks. Rita, yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that it's not. I mean, I think to conceive that the only way that we can relate to land or connect to land is if we own it, or if we have some kind of like ethnic attachment or history. I think that's kind of that's kind of what we're trying to undo. And I think that learning the history of a land, paying attention to the land in a different way than in just for its commodified potential, I think it uncovers, I think, ways that you can relate to the land and to the people who were on that land as an act of solidarity as well. So I think it's about shifting that mentality that you can only connect to land if you own it, or if you have a history with it. You can learn other people's histories as well, and that's part of the work of solidarity. Yeah.
Thank you so much. In my reflection to one thing that I wish I continue to more incorporate is also like the Kachin women. They are, because of their women, like patriarchy in terms of culturally, they cannot own the land, and they're really poor. And also displacement, one of the things is that they have to move because the dam or the mining is coming, so they have to move, and both culturally, economically, and politically disconnected from it. And yet still these women, like through every day, like they're the one who is looking for food for the family, and then they're the one who collect the herbs, and they really encounter what the land is degrading, that this is the land that is no more, that they've been connected to, like over the time is changing. And so I think how to connect, right? How to connect, even though within this like internally displaced people, like they don't feel, they are still within the country, but at the same time, they're still longing to go home. And so I think within this, we are in this like fractured relationship. And one thing that, like for me, it's like in our body, like we are embodied. This body carry the bones, the memories of ancestors. And I think this wanted to more highlight our creative and critical relationship with the land and also our ancestor way of living at the same time, like where we are standing today. I think I want to bring that our body as creature, as earthlings that is belong to this, the earth that we belong to. So I want to bring our body, our present here to that connecting with the land.
Okay. Well, I believe you might have a lot of questions like to ask to the panelists. there is the reception at the Loader Lounge after this panel discussion, so we can continue the conversation at the reception there. So as we ending this panel, opening panel, I would like to thank you for our 4 panelists. Please give your hands to them. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I don't want to break this mood, but I need to give announcement here too. One more announcement: the shuttle service to the hotel will commence at 9 p.m. We kindly remind you that the last shuttle will depart at precisely 9:30 p.m. After that, no more shuttle service, so make sure you live there. And other one for tomorrow, shuttle service will begin at 7:50 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. to this place, to this church. So remember, and hopefully you can be, if you don't like to take shuttle, you can walk to the church too. 20 minutes. Okay, thank you. So let's move to the reception together. Thank you.